4 days ago, a super typhoon named Bavi ran directly over a United States island with winds near 180 miles per hour. Tonight, that same storm reaches Japan. Forecasters are calling it weaker now, but they are also warning of 40 meter per second winds and 60 meter per second gusts over the Sakishima Islands, where the airports are already closed and the ferries have stopped. By the end of this video, you will understand why weaker does not mean safer, and why the one thing standing between these islands and disaster is a layer of warm water that nobody can see. The most powerful storm on the planet this year is going to pass over inhabited Japanese islands tonight. Its name is Bavi. Right now it is a mature, deeply intense super typhoon sitting over the sea east of the northern Philippines, and it is grinding west-northwest at about 20 kilometers per hour on a track that points almost directly at the southern end of Okinawa Prefecture. By the time the sun goes down over the Sakishima Islands this evening, the outer bands will already be there. By the early hours of tomorrow, the core will be as close as it is going to get, and the people on Ishigaki and across the Yaeyama chain will be riding it out with the airports closed, the ferries stopped, and the sea between them and the mainland completely impassable. I want to be precise about what we are looking at, because the official numbers are not vague and they are not reassuring. Japan's meteorological agency is carrying Bavi as Typhoon number 9. As of yesterday afternoon, its central pressure sat near 930 hectopascals, with maximum sustained winds around 180 kilometers per hour on the 10-minute standard the Japanese agency uses. A central pressure below 950 is what forecasters call deeply intense. This storm is well under that line. For a sense of scale, the strongest tropical cyclone ever measured on Earth, Typhoon Tip in 1979, bottomed out at 870 hectopascals. Bavi is not at that record, but it is in the company of storms that rewrite what an island expects to survive. Here is the part that makes tonight different from an ordinary typhoon warning. This is not a storm that might become dangerous. This is a storm that has already proven exactly how dangerous it is on another set of islands 4 days ago. And the same machine that flattened those islands is now turning toward Japan while it is still an intense, mature typhoon. Everything you're about to hear about the forecast for tonight is grounded in something Bavi has already done, in living memory to real people. That is what separates fear from data, and tonight the data is frightening on its own. Let me give you the forecast for the Sakishima Islands, exactly as Japanese forecasters have laid it out, because the progression tells the story better than any adjective could. This morning, average wind speeds of at least 15 meters per second were expected to spread across the Sakishima Islands, up through Okinawa's main island region and out to the Daito Islands. Through the day, those winds strengthen, with gusts of 30 meters per second or more possible from the daytime hours onward. Then comes the closest approach, late tonight into the early hours of tomorrow, and the numbers jump into a different category entirely. In some areas, average sustained winds are forecast to reach 40 meters per second, with instantaneous gusts that could exceed 60 meters per second. I want you to hold on to that number because it is easy to let it slide past. 60 meters per second is not a statistic. 60 meters per second is about 216 kilometers per hour, or roughly 134 miles per hour in a single gust. That is enough to peel a roof off its frame, pick up a parked vehicle, and turn a loose sheet of metal or a broken branch into something moving fast enough to kill. A sustained wind of 40 meters per second, which is about 144 kilometers per hour, is the kind of wind that does not let up between gusts. It is a continuous, roaring pressure against every wall and window facing the storm, hour after hour, in the dark, and it does not stop with the wind. After the closest approach, beginning tomorrow, the forecast calls for extremely heavy rain, more than 50 millimeters an hour, especially around the Sakishima Islands. That is a rate that overwhelms drainage, saturates hillsides, and sends water down steep island terrain in a hurry. High waves and storm surge are expected along the exposed coasts at the same time, so the islands are not facing one hazard tonight. They are facing wind, rain, surge, and waves layered on top of each other, over a landscape of steep slopes and long, unprotected coastline, all arriving inside the same narrow window. To put the duration in human terms, this is not a violence that comes and goes in a few minutes. A storm moving at roughly 20 kilometers per hour takes hours to pass, which means the islands closest to the track could sit inside these winds for the better part of a night. Every hour under that kind of load is another hour for water to find its way through a compromised roof, for a weakened window to finally give, for a tree already leaning to come down. Structures do not fail on the first gust. They fail on the 50th, or the 500th, after the wind has worked at the same weak point again and again in the dark. This is why the phrase very intense typhoon, which is how Japanese forecasters are describing Bavi's condition at closest approach, deserves to be read literally rather than skimmed. It is not boilerplate. It is a specific official assessment that the storm reaching these islands tonight will still be near the top of the scale that matters for the people underneath it. The most telling sign of how seriously this is being taken is what has already happened before the strongest winds have even arrived. On Ishigaki, the city's disaster prevention division has spent the last 3 days meeting, coordinating evacuation shelter arrangements, and pushing information out to residents. That is not a last-minute scramble. That is an island community that saw this coming and started moving people and plans into position days ahead of the wind. The specifics paint the picture. Ishigaki closed its most popular beach, Painuhama, through the weekend. It canceled residents' scheduled medical checkups, some Japan Airlines flights, and every single ANA flight in and out of both Ishigaki and Naha airports were canceled. Ferry service in and out of Ishigaki port was shut down through Saturday. Even United States military facilities on Okinawa, including Kadena Air Base, were tracking the storm and preparing for its approach. When the beaches close, the checkups stop, the planes are grounded, and the boats stay in port, an island is doing the one thing it can do, which is seal itself up and wait. That sealing up is exactly where the danger lives. These are islands. Once the airlinks close and the ferries stop, there is no leaving, and there is no quick help arriving. Whatever supplies, whatever shelter, whatever medical capacity is on Ishigaki tonight is what Ishigaki has until the storm passes and the links reopen, which will not be until well after the worst is over. The isolation that makes these islands beautiful on a calm day is the same isolation that makes a night like tonight so unforgiving. A community riding out a very intense typhoon on its own cannot call for the cavalry, because the cavalry cannot get across the water any more than the residents can. There's a human detail buried in that list of cancellations that is easy to miss. When Ishigaki called off residents' scheduled medical checkups, it was quietly acknowledging that for the next stretch of time, routine care stops. For an elderly resident or for someone managing a chronic condition, an island sealed off by a typhoon is not just an inconvenience. It is a period where the normal safety net of appointments, pharmacies, and quick transport to a larger hospital simply is not available. That is the quiet cost of isolation that never shows up in a wind speed forecast. And the clock is the cruelest part. Bavi's closest approach is within roughly 24 to 36 hours of the advisories that went out, which means the window to finish every preparation was measured in hours, not days. There is no comfortable lead time here. The people on these islands got the warning, understood exactly what was coming because this storm has a track record and had to move fast. By tonight, the time for preparation is over. The only thing left to do is get to a safe place and stay there. If you are wondering why this particular typhoon is getting this much attention when the Western Pacific produces storms every year, the answer is in its history and its timing. Bavi is the third Category 5 cyclone anywhere on the planet in 2026. That is not a normal year, and Bavi is not a storm that sputtered to life and is looking for somewhere to go. It has been on an unbroken march across the Western Pacific for a week, and it is arriving at Japan during the one phase of its life when it is neither still exploding in strength nor yet falling apart. It is sitting on its plateau, a fully mature and organized system, and Japan is being approached right in that transition. There is a genuine open question hanging over tonight, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the thing the islands cannot know in advance. Bavi is forecast to weaken as it goes, but the timing of that weakening is everything. If the collapse begins early, before the storm reaches Sakishima, the islands could be spared the worst of the forecast. If Bavi holds its violent structure just long enough to rake the islands before it breaks apart over cooler water, then the 40 meter per second winds and the 60 meter per second gusts verify exactly as written. Nobody gets to wait for that answer. The islands have to prepare for the worst version tonight, and they will only learn which storm actually came ashore once the wind is already screaming across Ishigaki. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the forecast. It is the honest shape of the situation. And it is the reason the word weakening, which is technically true, is one of the most misleading words attached to this storm. To understand why, you have to look at what Bavi has already done, and then at the physics of what it is doing right now. 4 days ago, on July 6th, Bavi crossed the northern Mariana Islands as a Category 5 super typhoon. These are United States islands, home to American citizens, in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The storm struck the island of Rota with maximum sustained winds near 290 kilometers per hour, which is about 180 miles per hour, and a central pressure around 910 millibars. Rota took a direct hit from the eye itself, and it sustained the worst damage in the entire Commonwealth. Think about what a direct eye strike at that intensity means on the ground. The reports out of Rota describe widespread destruction of critical infrastructure, roads blocked, port facilities damaged, power lost across the island, and water systems failing. That is the signature of a top-end storm running directly over a populated place. When the eye passes over you at that strength, you get the leading eyewall, then an eerie lull as the calm center crosses, and then the trailing eyewall hits from the opposite direction, often catching anything the first half loosened. Rhoda went through all of it. It is worth understanding what the numbers at Rhoda actually mean, because 290 kilometers per hour is difficult to picture. That is a sustained wind fast enough that staying upright outdoors is impossible. That ordinary buildings not engineered for it lose roofs and walls, and that the air fills with flying debris that becomes the primary threat to anyone caught outside. A central pressure of 910 millibars is the fingerprint of a genuine top-tier storm. The lower the pressure, the more violently the surrounding air rushes in to fill the void at the center, and 910 is deep into the range reserved for the strongest cyclones ever recorded. I am spending time on Rhoda for one reason. The Japan forecast for tonight is not a projection built from a computer model alone. It is a projection about a specific, known storm whose capabilities were just demonstrated in the most concrete way possible, on inhabited islands less than a week ago. When forecasters say Bavi could bring 60 meter per second gusts to Sakishima tonight, that claim carries the weight of Rhoda behind it. This is the same storm. It is a little weaker now than it was at its Category 5 peak, but only a little, and as we are about to see, the way it has changed since Rhoda may actually spread the danger over more of the Japanese islands rather than less. There is something else about this track that is worth pausing on. A single storm has now delivered, or is about to deliver, direct hits to islands under two different national flags inside a single week. Bavi struck American territory on July 6th and is forecast to strike Japanese territory tonight, 4 to 5 days later. One storm, 1 week, 2 nations. That is unusual, and it tells you something about the sheer distance and organization of this system. This is not a local squall. This is a Pacific-spanning event that has been dangerous across thousands of kilometers of ocean, and Japan is simply the next inhabited place in its path. Here is where I need to correct the single most dangerous headline attached to this storm. You will see the word weakening everywhere, and it is technically accurate. Bavi has come down from its Category 5 peak, but weakening does not mean safe, and in this specific case, it may mean the opposite of what your instinct tells you. The reason comes down to something called an eyewall replacement cycle. In a mature, intense typhoon, the ring of the fiercest winds circles a small, tight eye. As the storm ages, the outer rain bands can organize themselves into a second, larger ring, a new outer eye wall that slowly strangles the old inner one and takes its place. When that happens, the peak wind speed at the very center usually drops because the tightest, fastest ring has been replaced by a wider one. On paper, the storm is weakened. But the wind field, the total area covered by damaging winds, gets bigger. Bavi has had a partial eye wall replacement cycle underway. That is why its top wind number has eased off its Category 5 peak. But it is also why the storm has grown. A broader storm is not a gentler storm for the people it reaches. A broader storm pushes more water ahead of it, which means higher storm surge. A broader storm keeps any given location inside its damaging winds for longer, because there is simply more storm to pass over you. So the same process that let headline writers say Bavi is weakening may be the process that spreads its damaging winds across a wider stretch of the Ryukyu chain than a smaller, more intense core ever would have. Weaker at the center, broader at the edges, and more islands under the reach of it. Storm surge deserves its own moment here because it is often the deadliest part of a landfalling cyclone and the least visible in a wind forecast. Surge is the wall of seawater a storm shoves ahead of itself, piled up by the wind and pulled up by the low pressure at the center. A broader storm, like the one Bavi is becoming, is more efficient at building it because it pushes on a wider stretch of ocean for longer. Along the exposed, low-lying edges of these islands, that means seawater driven inland on top of whatever the waves and the rain are already doing. Wind gets the headlines, but water is what most often takes the lives. The second piece of the physics is the ocean itself. Typhoons run on heat, specifically the deep reservoir of warm water beneath the surface. Bavi's forecast weakening depends on it running out of that deep warm water along the final stretch of its path, with the terminal weakening phase expected to begin roughly 36 hours out. That is the source of the open question I raised earlier. If the warm layer along the approach to Sakishima is deeper than the models assume, the weakening could stall, and Bavi could arrive stronger than forecast. Warm water depth, not just the temperature at the surface, is what governs whether a storm like this holds its strength or falls apart. Tonight, that hidden layer of ocean heat is one of the few things standing between the forecast and something worse. You are going to see conflicting intensity numbers for this storm, and I want to explain why, because the gap gets weaponized into claims that somebody is hiding the truth. Western Pacific typhoons are measured mostly by satellite. using a method called the Dvorak technique, rather than by the Hurricane Hunter aircraft that fly into Atlantic storms. Satellite estimates come with real error bars. On top of that, different agencies average their winds over different time windows. Japan's meteorological agency reports 10-minute sustained winds, while the United States Joint Typhoon Warning Center reports 1-minute sustained winds, which run roughly 12 to 14% higher for the exact same storm. So two agencies can describe one typhoon with two different wind speeds and both be correct. That is not a cover-up. That is arithmetic. And predictably, because a major typhoon is aimed at land, the online claims have arrived that Bavi was steered or engineered, that its track toward Japan is the product of weather manipulation. That idea does not survive a look at the energy involved. A mature typhoon continuously releases power on the order of 10 to the 14th or 10 to the 15th watts. That is vastly beyond anything human technology can create, steer, or switch off. Bavi's west-northwest track is a textbook response to the subtropical ridge of high pressure and the upper-level winds that steer these systems. No one built this storm and no one is driving it. The honest version is more sobering than the conspiracy, because the honest version is that this happens on its own, and there is no facility anywhere that could turn it off tonight if we wanted to. Bavi's story does not end when it clears the Sakishima Islands. After its closest approach to Japan, the forecast track carries it north of Taiwan, and then on towards southeastern China, with a projected landfall near the eastern Chinese coast in the vicinity of Shanghai, around July 12th, 2 days from now. By then, it is expected to have weakened substantially down to tropical storm or minimal typhoon strength. But even a weakening Bavi is forecast to remain a powerful system, potentially still the equivalent of a Category 3, as it threatens Taiwan on the way. And an expansive field of gale-force winds is forecast to stretch across a broad area from Taiwan up to Okinawa, which means the disruption will not be confined to the single night the core passes closest. So the threat does not switch off at Sakishima. It moves. The same storm that menaces Japanese islands tonight will be a concern for Taiwan, and then for one of the most densely populated coastlines on Earth within 48 hours. This is the tail end of the arc I described at the start. A storm that began as a disorganized system in the open Pacific, exploded into a Category 5, struck American islands, is about to rake Japanese ones tonight, and will finally spend itself against the Chinese mainland. One system, tracing a line across the entire Western Pacific, dangerous at nearly every point along it. The Shanghai region matters here for a simple reason of scale. This is one of the most densely populated coastal zones anywhere on Earth, home to tens of millions of people and an enormous concentration of ports, industry, and low-lying urban land. A weakened Bavi is a very different threat there than a Category 5 would be. But a fading storm arriving over that much exposed population and infrastructure can still bring damaging wind, flooding rain, and coastal surge to a place where even a modest disruption reaches millions. The forecast weakening is real good news for the mainland, but it does not mean the mainland gets to look away. Here is what actually matters over the next 12 to 24 hours. The one question that decides how bad tonight gets is whether Bavi's forecast collapse arrives before or after its closest approach to Sakishima. Watch for the storm's structure as it nears the islands. If the terminal weakening kicks in early and the eye becomes ragged before closest approach, the islands catch a break. If the storm holds its organization until it clears them, the forecast for 40 meter per second, sustained winds, and 60 meter per second gusts is what verifies. And the rain that follows tomorrow, more than 50 millimeters an hour, becomes the next threat as it pours onto already battered, saturated ground. For the people on Ishigaki and across the Yaeyama Islands, none of that changes what tonight requires. The airports are closed, the ferries are stopped, the shelters are ready, and the only correct move is to be inside something sturdy and stay there until the all clear. The islands cannot outrun this, and they cannot wait for certainty. They have to treat it as the worst version of itself tonight, because by the time they know which storm actually came ashore, the wind will already be screaming across the coast. Bavi is the strongest storm this planet has produced all year. It has already shown exactly what it can do to an island, and it is arriving at Japan while it is still a very intense typhoon. Weakening is not the same as safe. The next time we check in, we will know whether the forecast held or whether the ocean gave these islands a reprieve. Until then, the only honest thing to say is that the worst of it is happening tonight, and the islands are as ready as a few hours of warning allowed them to be.